Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Madeline Milka, President and CEO of APAICS, and thank you so much for joining us today for this presidential appointment webinar. I'm really honored to have so many distinguished speakers with us on this webinar. As you may know, APAICS serves as a resource to the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community on how to enter public service. And our job is to help demystify the process so that government can be more accessible. As we know, also, presidential appointments are an incredible opportunity to be a public servant. A great deal of responsibility comes with serving in a presidential administration. And we're here so that you can understand what criteria is necessary and the considerations you might need to assess to make a career decision. So a personal consideration that you might want to think about is whether or not you align with the values of the presidential administration. Are you committed to the high volume of work? Because I will tell you that every single person here has worked extensively with many hours beyond your regular 40-hour work week. Some positions have a level of public scrutiny where your private life is also a factor. So how will this affect your family's support of your decision? And how will their lives be disrupted? Are you prepared to disclose your financials? And does your spouse have a conflict of interest? Are you willing to maintain two potential households should you need to relocate and your family remain in your home state or territory? Some of these personal considerations are taken when you think about the opportunity to serve. And so, in addition to these types of financial questions that would be under consideration, you would want to think about compensation because public servants are paid by the taxpayers. And so those sort of things are also something you might want to consider as you think about service as a presidential appointee. How does that affect your family when you think about those things? And so these are just some preliminary questions that we throw out there because that's probably some of the necessary things you need to think about before you even move into the process. And so the appointment is really about whether all of those questions can be answered and if the job itself is a good fit. And so we have a panel of experts here today who will be able to help, go through that process. They all went through it themselves. And they have served in both Democratic and Republican administrations. And so we are honored to have each of them here today. So love to introduce each of our panelists. And so I'll start on what I see on my screen. I have Tina Way Smith, who is an appointee from the 2019 to 2021 years. She served as the 8th Executive Director of the White House Initiative on Asian American and Pacific Islanders. She has also served in her initial stint in federal service in the Office of the Secretary and the Office of Public Liaison at the U.S. Department of Labor. So thank you so much, Tina, for joining us. We also have Krystal who serves as a member of the President's Advisory Commission on AANHPIs. She previously served as the executive director and now is a commissioner. And in her previous life in public service, she also served as the executive director of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, KPAC, under the chairwomanship of Congresswoman Judy Chu. And next, we also have Linda Shim. She served in the White House Office of Presidential Personnel, PPO, and oversaw the appointments and nominations of political appointees in the economic-focused federal agencies. And she also led PPO's engagement with members of Congress and external stakeholders in the Biden administration. And then we also have Benjamin Wu, who is an appointee under the President George W. Bush administration. He was confirmed by the U.S. Senate to serve in the administration subcabinet at the U.S. As U.S. Deputy Undersecretary of Commerce for Technology and the U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Technology. So obviously, all of these things are super important when it comes to seeing how federal agencies work, but also how do you fit into certain agencies and that type of experience. So thank you so much for all of you for joining us today. And the first question that I want to really throw to is Linda, let's start with how one knows about job opportunities. And we all hear sometimes, the language of DC. What is the Plum book? and when is it published?
Sure. Thanks for having us, Madeline. Excited to be here with all of you. The Plum Book, such a fun name for a for a document that just lists close to 4,000 political appointments that are available during any given presidency. So I'm sure several of you may have seen it, several of you may not have, but nowadays it can be easily found online through digital copies. If you Google Plum Book, Government Printing Office, GPO, you will see a PDF copy that pops up. And what you will see is you will see close to 4,000 or a little over 4,000 political appointments that exist during an existing presidency. For some, you might see more if more political jobs were created during that presidency. Some you may see less. The date in which most Plum books are published is December 1st of a given presidential election year. So we will see, for example, the Biden administration's Plum book that lists the positions throughout that time period published on December 1st of this year. And that might end up being the best guide for what jobs may transition over into the next administration. You know, I encourage folks to also take a look at the Plum book from previous administrations as well, since they might provide a guide depending on who holds the White House. So you will see not only your sort of senior level political appointments from secretary, assistant secretaries, undersecretaries, but you will also see mid-level and junior level appointments that exist in various offices in these agencies as well. And you will also see hundreds of part-time commission appointments that also exist as well.
Thank you so much. And typically there's around 3 to 4,000 political appointees. Is that correct?
That's
Somewhere,
correct.
somewhere around that number.
Around
It
around that
changes
number.
every
Mhm.
administration. So somewhere around that number. So we're talking about a total appointment of service of 3 to 4,000 jobs. So the next question would be, are there part-time opportunities that you can also keep your day job? And how do you know if there's a vacancy on a board or commission that you're interested in? So I'm gonna start with Tina and then go to Krystal.
Great, thanks for that question. So, a number aside from the Plum Book, you also want to look at the Federal Advisory Committee Act that governs the boards and the commissions for federal positions, and that's not including congressional ones as well. But there is, and I can drop that into Mel, I can drop it into the chat box, the link for that. But there is sort of a database. It's not easy. It's a little bit clunky to kind of shuffle through it, but you can see what various committees, commissions, boards that currently exist. Most of these are uncompensated, but there are some boards that are actually compensated. Just think of it as serving on a nonprofit board. And their commitment levels are different. But if you look through, and I'll share this in chat box, but if you look through the database, you'll see specifically how the membership is comprised, how they're selecting members for that. And they're sometimes they are drawing nominations through the federal registrar. So you will see, and you can also go through that database to see what are the announcements, what are the opportunities. So there's just various ways of figuring out what is happening right now. And once you've figured out, and I think Krystal will probably give a better insight since she's sitting on one of the FACA governed commissions right now to share more about personal experience on that. But you can also you'll want to see, who has authority over these commissions and boards, and, who has those responsibilities, because it is listed. And there is an opportunity, you could probably reach out to that person to ask more questions, find out who's currently sitting on the board to learn more about that particular board. But I'll just kick it over to Krystal to talk about her current position.
Sure. Thanks, Tina. And thank you, Madeline, and to APAICS for hosting us today. As Tina mentioned, there are a number of federal advisory committees, or what we call FACA, that are part-time positions. And their goal is to advise the federal government on various issues, but to bring in outside experts on those priorities. And so, for instance, I was most recently, as Madeline mentioned, Executive Director of the White House Initiative and the President's Advisory Commission on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders until about 2 weeks ago. And you know, those require full-time, it's a full-time job. It requires being physically based in DC. I needed a little bit more flexibility with my schedule to be able to assist with some caretaking needs for one of my parents. And so as a result, I decided to roll off of that role, but have since been appointed by the president to join the President's Advisory Commission, which is a part-time role, uncompensated, but it allows me to still stay engaged with the work while having the flexibility to not have to be full-time based in Washington, D.C. and working the hours that I was working in my prior role. There are a number of other boards and commissions, as Tina mentioned, and so oftentimes they are agency specific. So I know that within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, for instance, where the current White House Initiative and President's Advisory Commission for the AANHPI community is based, there are a number of health advisory boards too. So if you are a physician or a health policy advocate and want to be involved in any number of these boards and commissions, they oftentimes will solicit and look for individuals. We see the same with other agencies, the Department of Education, if you are an educator or involved in education policy. The census has its own advisory committee. So there are any number of, again, many federal advisory committees that are available. And oftentimes it's looking for subject matter expertise. So, you know, making sure that if you are interested in a specific topic, really looking at that particular federal agency that has jurisdiction over those issues and seeing what opportunities may exist. And then to Tina's point, in addition to looking in the Federal Register, oftentimes it is also important to stay in touch with the Presidential Personnel Office that will be in charge of those appointments, and also with the relevant department or agency that is also in charge of that board or advisory committee. And I agree with Tina. I think it's really helpful if you can find people who are already on those boards and commissions. They are all publicly listed. We are required to register the names of all of the federal advisory committees and the membership of them, so that it is open to the public. So you can see again who are members of these boards and commissions, and if they are people you're interested in reaching out to or may know personally. I think oftentimes it is helpful to learn about their own experience getting involved with that board and commission. The terms also vary. So I know, for instance, for the current President's Advisory Commission, and most of the FACAs, most of the federal advisory committees, they are authorized usually for a 2-year term, but sometimes they are longer. So, it's really important also to look at how long those terms are, whether you have the bandwidth to do to serve, and then also looking at when there may be vacancies. So again, that's not always publicly posted in real time. So oftentimes that is, again, checking in with relevant staff, whether that's in the White House or in the White House Liaison's office for that relevant department, just to make sure that they're aware of your interest in serving and can keep you abreast of vacancies as they occur.
So there was also a follow-up question to that. Can you serve on a federal advisory committee or commission while being a federal employee?
I don't believe so. So I think usually those are, or Linda would maybe have a better answer here, having worked in PPO. I know for in my situation, for instance, I was not able to do both concurrently. So once I officially departed from my role as executive director of the initiative and the commission, I was able to then be formally appointed to the commission. But Linda, I don't know if you have more insight there.
No, for sure. And just based off of what I know, there will be certain positions on commissions that where public servants will serve based upon title. So, for example, a member of Congress or a secretary or a specific vacancy holding that title at that time might be statutorily obligated to serve on that commission. Other than that, I don't know if I've seen other federal, but Tina might know more. Just to add a clarifying point too on commissions as well is PPO will handle the commissions that are listed in the Plum book that require a presidential appointment or a Senate confirmation in order to serve on that commission or board. There are still, I believe, thousands of others that Tina and Krystal have mentioned that you can find through the FACA website that secretaries and other members of the administration might be able to appoint on their own. So that's helpful to know, I think, depending on what type of appointment you're looking for, that there might be a more specific or issue-driven advisory board through an agency that may not require a presidential appointment. So be sure to look out for those opportunities as well.
Yeah, and just to build on what Linda has already shared, I think you'll want to make sure that you look through, and because if you're looking at that FACA database that I think staff has posted, you'll want to look at the charters and review some of those requirements as well and eligibility information, because they might say specifically, that federal employees are not allowed to serve. And so you'll want to look into the charters. And there are also ones where congressional members are selecting an individual. So there could be a combination of who is selecting and making up that board or commission. I also want to point out, in addition, there are congressional commissions. And so I think there's another link that's been shared out from the CRS on the listing from 2023 of what those commissions currently exists. And so those would be appointed. Some have features in it where it has to be appointed by the executive branch as well. So there's combinations and some overlap there. So it does take a bit of homework of trying to navigate and figure out where all of these various options are and what are the openings and who's in charge. But certainly these are hopefully helpful links to get you all started.
And when we conclude this webinar, we'll send out the recording along with all the links, of which Tina very thoughtfully has sent over. And so you'll get the actual links to each of the items that have been discussed. Before we continue on with additional questions, I want to recognize and welcome Mona Mohib, who has joined us also as a panelist. She served in the Clinton-Gore administration as Associate Director for the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs at the White House, and also the Director of Office of Intergovernmental Affairs at the U.S. Department of Labor under Secretary Alexis Herman. So welcome, Mona. Our next question, thank you. Our next question goes to Ben and Mona. So perfect timing. Ben, we'll start with you. How much discretion do cabinet members, agency heads, and assistant secretary level appointees have in staffing their offices?
Well, first, thank you, Madeline, for hosting this informative webinar. And also thanks to APAICS and all of you for your interest in serving. Starting from the Reagan administration in 1980, every presidential administration has set a new record for APA appointments, and then had that record exceeded in the successive presidential administrations, except for the current and the previous administrations. And this may be just a reflection that the most recent or single-term administrations, but we're all looking and hoping that the new incoming administration will be committed to once again set a new record for APA appointments. So to answer your question regarding the discretion that cabinet members, agency heads, and assistant secretary level appointees have in staffing their offices, I think it differs from administration to administration. But I can tell you that in the President Bush 43 administration, there was a great deal of discretion given to the cabinet members, the agency heads, and the assistant secretaries to be able to staff up their offices with people who they felt were not only qualified, but could work well together. Working as a team and working as a collective unit for the Bush 43 administration was very important. So when I came over to the administration, I spent 13 years working in Congress, and I was actually approached during the Bush 41 to see whether or not I might be interested in working in the then Bush 41 administration. And at the time, I had just started working in Congress. And so I deferred and said, thank you, but maybe in a second term, I'll give it some consideration. Well, as you know, there was no second term for Bush 41. So I guess, if you're interested in working for the administration, you should always explore opportunities. And it's, as Madeline has said, it's a great opportunity to not just serve the country, but to really get engaged in issues of really great importance that impact our community and the country as well, too. The response back, or at least the example that I can give you for the discretion that's given for the cabinet and the subcabinet to be able to help staff the administration through my personal experience was that back when President Bush had created his cabinet, he had appointed or nominated Norm Mineta to be the Secretary of Transportation. And so Norm had also served for 6 months to close out the Clinton administration prior. And so when I saw Norm during one of the inaugural balls, and I had known Norm for a long time because of the work that we had done together in Congress, but also Norm, as many of you know, was one of the founders and true inspirations for the creation of APAICS. And so I had served on the advisory board that created APAICS, working with Norm as the organization first began. And so Norm was excited and said, yeah, let's make it happen. So my intention was to go work for Norm in the new administration. The problem was that my background working on the Hill was working with our nation's technology and competitiveness policy. And so I really didn't have any direct experience working in transportation issues. I was like a square peg trying to fit into a circle. And so we tried a number of permutations, and including the deputy counsel over transportation, head of the research agency over at transportation. But the head of the research agency, then RESPA, included pipeline regulation and management, which was a major and a very important aspect of transportation. And so we just really didn't find the right appointment for me in transportation. And then along came a call from a friend of mine who I'd worked with on the Hill and offered an opportunity to work at Department of Commerce, working on our nation's technology and competitiveness policy, including providing management and oversight over the agencies that I had worked on in committees that included the budgetary and legislative oversight of the Department of Commerce, as well as others engaged in the nation's technology and the president's technology policy. So that was a perfect fit. And as a consequence, I migrated over with Norm's blessing because he recognized that this was almost too perfect a fit for me. And I wouldn't have arrived at that position, but for the fact that I had contacts and friends in the agency and also in the administration, and especially over at Commerce, that felt that I would be a good fit for them. And so I do think that the cabinet members, the agency heads, and the assistant secretary appointees do have a great deal of discretion, and they should, because these are the people who they'll be working together. They do want to get the best and the brightest, and people who they can work with well. And there's always going to be some requests and suggestions made from PPO, as well as, especially if you're coming off of a campaign and a new administration, there will be a desire, especially for those that have demonstrated particular skills or have been instrumental in working the campaign, to try to transition them into the new administration. But at least from my engagement and experience with, at least from Bush 43, there wasn't a mandate to put certain people in. It was a collaborative effort in conjunction with the cabinet members, the agency heads, and the assistant secretary and the sub-cabinet folks. But I think it does pay to have that connection, and it can be very helpful as well too, because it should be, and it was in 43, a collaborative effort to try to staff the administration with the best and the brightest and the people who they believe had the skill sets and experience that could help drive the country forward.
I'll jump in. Ben, thank you. Really appreciate that, Council. First of all, huge honor to be with this panel. I don't know how I snuck in, but thank you, Madeline. I really appreciate it. My experience, I want to answer the question, but maybe with a little context of my experience. My experience was I was not as established as Ben was at the time when he was thinking about what his potential opportunities to serve in an administration. He had, as he said, he's spent more than a decade on the Hill. I was about 25 years old, so I was sort of on the other end of the scale. And I had worked on the reelect for President Clinton and Vice President Al Gore in 1996. So my experience was different in a couple of ways. One, there had already been one administration, so there was a number of folks who continued to stay in their political appointment. So it wasn't like we were coming in new and everything was available. There were actually much more limited options because so many people were choosing to continue with the administration, at least for the first year or so after the reelect. And I had also come in through having worked on the campaign, worked really hard for the year, and was told very much that there was definitely an interest in helping me get placed. So I had zero experience. I had no idea. Every day was sort of a new adventure for me. But I was very fortunate, like Ben, to have established a number of relationships with people who I think were very interested in helping me figure out what that next step, but certainly to give me the opportunity to serve. So I was very fortunate. I don't think I could have predicted that my first political appointment would have been at the White House. Felt very lucky to have spent time there and then over time sort of build my credentialing internally in the administration to then be the director of intergovernmental for the U.S. Department of Labor with Secretary Herman. I agree with Ben has to say. I so appreciate his feedback. The only thought, and of course I have to defer to Linda and others, I'm sure other people have said that. And I do think that assistant secretaries, deputy secretaries, and secretaries or department agency heads definitely have thoughts on how they want to shape. But my experience has been very much that it is truly all driven by presidential personnel, right? Because they have the broadest view of people who have sent in resumes, who've served on the campaign, have found who are on the Hill, but would be great partners like Ben to join the administration. So I think definitely people can weigh in and have, as Ben said, in different departments and agencies, different levels of success. But I think a lot of it really is driven by presidential personnel, which has a very global view on what they want the administration to look like, making sure, as Ben said, that we have the very best people at every level, whether it's a very junior person as I was, or someone with the tremendous background that Ben brought. So super honored. The final thing I'd say is as I mentioned, really didn't understand the process. After I'd worked on the reelect, someone told me what the Plum book was, had no idea. But I think it's sort of building relationships with people was really the one thing that helped me to working, I hope, incredibly hard. And then 3, sort of figuring out what the right fit, and I know we've got questions about this later in the program, but there's almost something about being 25 or 26 years old where I had a much wider scope of the things that I could have done versus Ben, who had real policy specialties. So, but it obviously worked out great for me. I'm very privileged to have served and again, thrilled to be on this panel with everybody.
Yeah, and if I could just add on to Mona's point, which I thought were very great, if the tip of the spear is the PPO and the White House. Everything gets coordinated through the White House. So while at least in a Bush 43 administration, they did give us a lot of discretion in making recommendations. We didn't have the sole authority to make that appointment. We had to work in conjunction and collaboratively with not just PPO, but also our White House liaison. But they were very solicitous of suggestions and also of options. When I needed to replace my deputy, I was reached out to by our White House liaison and also presidential personnel to ask what my thoughts were so that they could help select from the pool of people in their large database of someone who might be people who I should consider. So I did review several options and names. I came up with what I thought, working with my secretary, the best person, and we cleared it through collectively and collaboratively with the Presidential Personnel Office. But I think that we were very fortunate to be given that kind of discretion, and they were very solicitous of our input, and so that was always very appreciative. Sometimes, given the position, sometimes given the person, you may not have as much in other administrations, but ideally, the cabinet members, the agency heads, and assistant secretary have a great deal of input, and also in final sign-off, although the process was signed off. But our presidential personnel always made sure that we were okay or pleased with the person that would be reporting to us.
Which leads us to a really great question about the other stakeholders who are involved in this process, which are the members of Congress. So they often have a viewpoint as well in terms of their interests and making sure that there are folks that they are taking care of. So, what's the role that they have, in these appointments? And I'll throw that to Linda.
Sure. And following up on what Ben and Mona mentioned, that level of deference, it's always great when there's collaboration. I think in the beginning, what I saw was the beginning of an administration after a complete flip. So there was a need to get a large amount of bodies into positions from the very beginning. And due to that volume flow, you just had a lot of outside stakeholders with political equities that were also weighing in. So to Madeline's question in regards to members of Congress, they do play a important role. The one thing I didn't mention about the Plum Book too is there are a little over 1,300 positions that require Senate confirmation. So if you think about it that way, especially for your most senior positions, right? Some that Ben had mentioned, ranging from the secretary, the top principal at the agency, to your list of assistant secretaries or undersecretaries that require Senate confirmation. Those folks, you hear a lot about names to consider from the US Senate, especially from members who sit on the Committee of Jurisdiction, and which those senators or which those positions must go through in order to reach the Senate floor for a vote. So if you think about sort of that outsized role that senators particularly play, if you have relationships in the Senate and do have expertise in that field, and you had already been advising the Senate in whether you're testifying at hearings or you're a known expert that has been advising various members of the Senate, those folks, the senators may call in to weigh in and recommend for certain positions. The way that I would think about other members of Congress as well, especially on the House side, is you see them being very active in both campaigns at this moment, right? So they're not only surrogates, but they're also donors to a certain extent. And so when you think about people who are bringing a lot of, or that are gaining a lot of political equity with who will become the sitting president, House members can also play that outsized role as well as trusted stakeholders. So they will also be sending in recommendations for names that range from sort of their top tier priorities to a long list of names. It really just depends on how the member of Congress organizes their advocacy. But, one way to think about it is at the end of the day, the beginnings of a PPO being set up, thousands of names may have just already come in from members of Congress alone. So just especially with a extremely tight Senate, I think senators particularly will play an outsized role because they will have to be the president's allies in getting people confirmed. And the confirmation process has only gotten more difficult as the vote margin has tightened in the Senate and our politics has become a little bit more polarized. So especially if you're going for a very senior level role that requires a confirmation, having allies in the Senate who will go to bat for you, not only with PPO and the president, but also throughout your confirmation process is going to be critical. I will also add that there are other outside stakeholders that PPO will look to for recommended names, for suggestions, organizations like APAICS and other community organizations. We had a whole team, at least in the PPO that I served in, that worked with outside organizations like APAICS and the National Urban League, and just dozens of organizations that wanted to have a say in creating a diverse and robust administration. So I also encourage you to see what organizations may also be weighing in on behalf of candidates and be creating resume banks. And for any Hill staffers, the Hill Staff Associations also create their resume banks to submit. And at times, when you're looking at a database of over 100,000 resumes that have come in, when you are seeing recommended names, that can help highlight your name and at least out of that larger pile in the very beginning.
And if I could just add on to Linda's thoughts and comments about the Senate confirmation process. For those that are seeking a Senate confirmed position, you also need to be, as Linda mentioned, to be aware of the unexpected and realize that once you go through the process, the calendar, the timing, all these external factors now suddenly are at play. And it also impacts your life tremendously too, because once the presidential nomination is announced, for the most part, they don't want you to have any issues, at least through the confirmation hearing and then subsequently the confirmation vote. So that may mean that you're going to have to resign from certain positions. You're going to have to basically be in a holding pattern for an unknown period of time. And politics, especially as you get closer to an election, may impact that as well too. So I know colleagues of mine who had been waiting back in their hometowns for what they thought was a pretty easy confirmation process that got caught in the vortex of politics, and suddenly they were waiting months, sometimes years, waiting and hoping for the process to go through. Meanwhile, they have to go and live their lives, and it can be very disruptive. So that's part of the bargain of a Senate confirmed position, is that it's one of the most senior positions in the administration, but it also can be very disruptive to your life as you're going through the process. And that doesn't even include the FBI background check, the Senate confirmation questions in the process, the scheduling of the hearings. It just needs to go through the process, and that requires a lot of patience for anybody who may be impacted through a Senate confirmation process, especially for those that aren't in the Washington area or don't fully appreciate the disruptive nature of that on their lives.
Thank you, Linda and Ben, for those tips. I think one of the things that most people are going to think about now is really, what if I don't have any connections to DC? What if I don't know how this process really starts? So one of the things that we've said in previous webinars is that it's a very opaque process. There's not a lot of transparency when it comes to it. So let's start from the beginning, and I'll throw this to Tina and Krystal. You want to serve, you don't know anyone in this world. What's the reality of securing an appointment, and how can you improve your chances?
Chris, I'll let you go first since I went first last time.
Sure. Well, so I know I can't speak for every administration, but under the Biden-Harris administration, as Linda mentioned, because it was a flip in administration and they were looking to staff up, again, thousands of positions immediately. I know that there was also solicitation on the website, just a general website that was set up. So anybody could go in from the general public to fill out a form, and, it asked for your contact information, potential agencies that you're interested in. It also asked for questions like, have you managed staff before? Have you overseen a budget? And so you would go in and fill out all of those things, and then you would upload your resume or CV at the end. So I know that under this administration, again, the process was very open. And I think, I think that was very intentional to be able to ensure that we were building an administration that looks like America. And I know for those who do not have, again, ties to Washington, D.C., many of us get our jobs that way, but that is not the only way. And as Madeline, you mentioned, I think just even webinars like the one that you're hosting today through APAICS is so critical, just to be able to demystify the process, because it is not very transparent, even to those of us who live in Washington, D.C. So I think it's really important to be able to understand, how does this process work, and when to start, reaching out to folks. For those who do not have political connections, whether that's, doing what Mona did, joining a campaign and then getting in that way, or working on the Hill, working with elected officials who can validate and vouch for you. I think it is really important to look at your own network and to see, again, who do you know who may have access to those who are going to be in positions of power to influence and make hiring decisions. And again, APAICS is a great example of an organization, a nonprofit organization in the community that does have direct ties into the White House, and regardless of who may be serving, because APAICS is a nonpartisan organization. There are also other nonprofit organizations. So oftentimes, as departments and agencies are looking to staff up too, they are looking for subject matter experts, as Ben mentioned. And so, maybe you're somebody who lives in California or in Texas, and you don't know Washington, D.C. well, but you are a really well-known person in your particular field, whether that be in the medical field or as an educator. And so finding also large associations, whether that be nonprofit organizations, or if you're a member of a union, and you can have, again, those, organizations that do have national clout and also influence, making sure your intentions are known to your network as well locally, so that they can help to push up your name nationally. I know that when I was with the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus too, not only did we take recommendations directly from members of Congress themselves, but oftentimes they were hearing from their own constituents. And that wasn't always a direct tie to the constituent themselves. Sometimes it was hearing from a local nonprofit organization or a trusted leader in their community, and then being able to then meet with that person, build those relationships. And if they could, validate, then they would then put them on a slate. So there are many ways, I think, that you can, get those ties. It doesn't have to be all through the national kind of DC. In the Beltway, if you have, again, local ties in your community and have people who can vouch for you and connect you with larger organizations and really help to validate you, that is going to be really critical as well, to really building your network. Oftentimes people say that when you're going for these positions, it is like building out like a mini campaign around yourself. Who can you identify within your network who can vouch for you? And you want to be strategic about who that is. You don't want to just have, 100 letters from different folks who have no influence with the incoming administration. You want to make sure that, again, you're being very strategic with who are you asking to weigh in for you, whether that be an elected official or a nonprofit organization or a particular, a trade association or entity that has a lot of clout with a specific department or agency that they may already be doing work with. So thinking about, again, what are those ties? I'm going to toss over to Tina. I'm sure she also has a lot more to share as well.
Thanks, Krystal. That was super, super comprehensive. So for the past 3 years, I've been working with the International Leadership Foundation. So much like APAICS, we have our set of fellows that we place into federal agencies, departments, offices, both with political appointees and also with civil servants. And so maybe I'll couch my answer more towards a younger crowd on how you might get started. And we do a lot of webinars and sessions with them as well, kind of showing them the ropes, the lay of the land, and bringing in folks who, like Linda, have been in the PPO seat on how do you navigate into a political appointment. So some of the things that Krystal has already touched upon, internships, I think are so key, whether that's through APAICS, OCA, there's a number of fantastic organizations out there, but I really do think there's such a great way, just like any other industry, to get your foot into the door and to make yourself known and to meet folks. I tell students all the time, do not underestimate your alumni network, no matter how big or small your school is. I ended up going to the University of Illinois, and it just so happened there were two API appointees in the Bush administration at the time I was graduating, and that truly was one of the, that was my network into a political appointment for myself. And so I always tell students, look into your networks, your alumni networks, and continue to build those networks. And trying to find potential mentors, folks who would be willing to just grab a coffee with you and that you can learn from and build some genuine relationships. Looking at transition teams, as much as we might be able to glean from who is heading and which, sometimes it's various transition teams are going on at the same time, but trying to figure out, who are the folks at the helm of an upcoming administration, volunteering for campaigns. And I think that's especially something that is a little bit more attainable, especially for a young person or a college student. And when I was interning at the White House, there were also folks who were volunteering as staff and working their way through as well into potential appointments. And just like working on the Hill, working for think tanks, advocacy organizations, I mean, just getting kind of that start in Washington, D.C. And I hate to say, but I do think that there is such premium on folks who are already sort of boots on the ground in Washington, D.C. And this is particularly for younger folks, too, who are trying to kind of break into the D.C. scene. But I know lots of folks who have temporarily maybe just moved into the D.C. area to scout out for jobs, and folks meeting people as much as possible in person, but getting to know people, network in that way is unfortunately sometimes more productive than doing that remotely. But I also think, times have shifted, right? We're all working remotely and more so remotely. And there's probably more opportunities to connect from, across the country. That's making it probably easier for folks to be able to juggle not being in the district. So, I think that it's making things a lot easier too.
So one of the things that, we often talk about is, what happens if you end up getting an offer and you're not really particularly interested in it? So should you decline it? Would you, think about what's the impact of your chances of getting another opportunity or offer? So wanted to throw that out there also for Mona and Ben.
Sure, Ben, if it's okay, I'll start. And I think
Absolutely.
Ben and I are like the perfect tandem for where we were with our experience. So Ben, I actually kind of laid it out perfectly, where obviously who wouldn't want to work with Norm, looking at DOT, but given his experience, it made much more sense for him to be at Commerce. He had, I think, probably more authority than I did to sort of determine what my potential next steps are. For me, who it's crazy to think, but was very much at the beginning of their political career, I think I was more apt to take almost anything I might be offered. It so happened that it was the White House, but I did talk to DOT and other places too, but they were the first ones to come through. And I think it seems to me sort of earlier in your career, getting in is like the hard hurdle. And if you're in, then you're able to, I found you were able to navigate once you were inside. So, you could, say you ended up, what if I had done it the other way and I got the Department of Labor job first? I might have been like, I have zero experience on these issues, but there were tremendous people in the building. So just the idea to be very early in my political career, to learn from incredible, both political and policy minds, you just don't know what an open door will provide for you or expose you to. And so if you're on the front of your career, I'd be pretty flexible in terms of, unless there's something very, very specific. But the great part about serving in this kind of an appointment is that while there are people who are very specific in their lane, we do all tend to do a lot. And I learned a ton on things I had like zero background on. The other piece is that once you're in, that's sort of like, I think, the hardest hurdle. And once you're in, I think if you're very good and talented and work hard, there's some level of flexibility. I went from the White House to labor, where, by the way, my parents noted that I had virtually tripled my salary, which only meant I was making below poverty level. But this was almost 30 years ago, so I'm confident it's better than it was proportionally. But there were also people doing it the opposite, where they were at a department or agency and they detailed over to the White House. So actually, that's sort of seemed like the best gig, is like you can sort of keep your leveling and maybe sort of, and then you did, you know, like you detail over to the White House. So that means you're still an employee of the Department of Treasury or Transportation or Commerce. So I think the hardest part is getting in. So if I were on the front end of my career, I would be very open, even if it doesn't feel like everything you've ever imagined you wanted to do, because you have no idea the people you'll meet, the opportunities that'll come up, and kind of the exposure to maybe new policy areas that you would have never thought about. I worked, when I went to the White House, I worked in the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs. That's the office at the White House, but then across the federal government, where you are the interface with state and local elected officials. That's something I did 30 years ago. And while I am primarily a federal registered lobbyist and I lobby the Hill and the administration, there's still a huge portion of my current career and the career between Clinton and today where I still very much live in the state and local elected official land. And that's something I had zero exposure to, really learned in my time, and have kind of carried with me. So that would have been my experience as sort of someone on more of the front end of my career in Washington. Ben.
No, thanks, Mona. You know, there's this movie from the 70s, Love Story, with Ali McGraw and Ryan O'Neal. And the catchphrase from that movie was, "Love means never having to say you're sorry." Well, presidential appointments means the process also means, you know, never having to say you're sorry. You can say, as Mona mentioned and suggested, that you can decline a position and still get another one. And I personify that, I guess. But as Mona said, also, you got to be tactical because sometimes for some people, you get one bite of the apple. And then they move on because there's so many people who the administration and PPO needs to fit in. And so it's possible that if you don't take a certain position, that you may not get another position offered to you immediately. And as Mona mentioned, tactically, it does make some sense. If you're in the administration, then you can potentially move around, especially if you get in early enough and then the administration goes to another term. There's a natural transition period for people to stay in the administration but do something else as well too. The key, I think, is to try to find a position that you'll be happy with, that you believe can make a difference, and that is led by good leadership. I can't underscore the importance of that. You know, it really rises from the top, from the president to the cabinet secretary, if you're in one of the agencies, and then the sub-cabinet positions, leaders. So if you're in the right position, with strong leadership, good support, and an important mission for the country, you can't go wrong, irrespective of whether or not that may be the one that you are looking for. You know, one thing also is that, you know, don't take the appointments process personally, because sometimes you're the right fit and it all works out, And sometimes you're the right fit and it doesn't work out. And there are so many factors that go into the appointment process. And politics also. Who controls the majorities in both the House and the Senate? The PPO in looking over trying to find the right people. There's so many external factors that while it may be your dream to work in administration, if it doesn't work out, don't take it personally. There are always, or not should say always, but there may be other opportunities to serve, either in a commission, in your board, and there's also, don't overlook the gubernatorial positions on the state as well as local positions as well too. So, I think it's so important for our community to be well represented. So making sure that we have a seat at the table, that we have a voice at all levels, from the federal, state, and local. Don't give up on that, even if the vagaries of the politics and the factors that impact the appointment process may not break your way.
Madeline, if it's okay, can I just give like a really quick example? I graduated from Wellesley in 1992. The First Lady of Arkansas was spending a lot of time at her alma mater, Wellesley, on her way up to New Hampshire to campaign for her husband, the governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton. And I, met her on campus a bunch of times. We both were president. I thought, oh my gosh, this is like totally my way in. And I just sent a bunch of letters to Little Rock. I had no idea what I was doing and never heard back. And I was like distraught for the first administration and somewhat jealous because I felt like they had missed me and like they were certainly at a loss for me not being part of this process. But it unbelievably worked out that 4 years later, sort of, I had a chance to go in, and I was 4 years older and I had 4 years more experience and maturity. And I actually think in a weird way that was really worked out to my advantage, that I wasn't someone who had zero experience and went in, because these are really important decisions, and every role, whether you're someone's assistant or you're an assistant secretary, are all critical to the success of an administration. And it actually, I think, worked out for me better that it didn't work out for the first time and that it did all work out the second time, because I feel like I was more valuable to the administration 4 years later. Now, that might be me compensating for not going in. I probably would have thought I would have been great the first time. But to Ben's point, like, sometimes things, just work out in a different way.
Thank you to all of our panelists. I know we're a little bit over, and I know that we haven't been able to get to all of your questions, but we've noted all of them. This is the first of many webinars as we get into this process, because this is something that APAICS is dedicated dedicated its time in making sure that people understand how to get into public service, and this is one of those opportunities. So we've noted all your questions. We will go back and try to answer them in a future webinar. Let's take a moment to thank all of our panelists. Feel free to share this out to anyone else who you think would like to learn more about the presidential appointment process. We're really excited to continue doing this so that people can learn about the process and consider themselves in these roles. So thanks everyone for tuning in today, and we look forward to seeing you the next time.